Welcome to Strength to Overcome, where we explore faith, pursue truth, and grow stronger together. I'm Matthew Morton. Let's dig in. G'day everyone, welcome back to the Strength to Overcome podcast. I'm Matthew Morton, your host, and I'm blessed to be back with you for another episode this week. Before we get into today's episode, I want to say something. This episode has taken me a couple of weeks to put together, and I've actually recorded this episode several times, and I keep coming back to it because there's so much to unpack here, and I've spent a lot of time thinking, praying, and meditating, researching about how I want to best approach this conversation, because I know there are a lot of people listening who may be dealing with some very real, very personal things connected to what we're going to be talking about today, and I want to make sure I'm very sensitive to that. Also need you to understand and know that I'm not coming into this conversation pretending that I've got it all figured out. I'm coming into it as somebody that's lived through some of what we're going to be talking about and learned from it. I've struggled with it, and I have spent an enormous amount of time and effort and energy trying to understand it. And so if you're listening to this today and this topic is hitting close to home, I want you to know that I understand that. And I will do my absolute best to handle this conversation with honesty, humility, and respect. All right, so let's dive in on episode 59, which I have titled The Hidden Dangers of Lust and Pornography. I'm going to attempt to work through this topic that affects almost everybody, but it's almost never talked about. This is something that I have found over the years to be incredibly taboo. Nobody's really wanting to go out and have an honest, open conversation about it. Now, I grew up in a very tight-knit religious community, and I remember going to church and Bible studies, social events, carrying this burden that nobody could see, and I felt like I couldn't talk to anybody about it. I didn't know who to talk to. I didn't know what to say. And I certainly didn't want to expose myself and have somebody look at me differently because of what I was struggling with. And I think there's another real reason that we need to talk about this, because this isn't just something that's happening outside of religious communities. It's happening inside them too. And I've actually been a part of church presentations, conversations over the years where pornography, sexual temptation, and accountability are things that are being discussed. And so I'm not standing here pointing my finger at anybody else. I've been part of the conversation, and I've also been part of the problem. And I think that distinction is important, because I remember hearing a story many years ago about this convention for pastors and Christian leaders. And the story was that somebody connected to the hotel that had access to the information shared what was happening in the rooms during that weekend. And the number that was presented in this story was something like 90% of the rooms had engaged in some form of explicit material on their TVs during the convention. Now, I want to be careful because I wasn't there and I don't know that number specifically, but that's the number, that's the concept that I remember from this story many, many years ago. And so it's not something that I can verify, but it's a story that stuck with me. Because it wasn't really the number of the story, it was the irony. People had gathered in this religious environment to talk about faith, morality, leadership, helping other people, saving other people, you know the drill. And yet, behind the closed doors at the end of the day, some of the very people, the speakers leading those conversations, were apparently dealing with some battle that really nobody wanted to talk about. It wasn't a topic of the weekend. And it reminds me of some research that I came across about how normalized pornography has actually become among younger people. It was a 2015 study. It was summarized by Josh McDowell's organization. And they reported that 90% of teens and 96% of young adults said that when they talk about pornography with their friends, the conversation is neutral, accepting, or actually encouraging. I'll let that sink in for a second. 90%, 96%. Now, this is not a fringe issue where it's 50-50. This is a cultural issue. And maybe that's why people don't want to talk about it being a problem. Because it's not just the guy sitting, well, in the back pew of a church. It could be the guy playing the organ. It could be the guy leading the worship, for crying out loud. It could be somebody sitting in the congregation. It could be somebody at the front delivering the sermon. And I'm not saying that everybody in those positions is struggling with pornography. What I'm saying is religious environments don't make people immune to human temptation. They don't. And if you clicked on this episode and you decided that, this time I'm going to actually look for some solutions, then I appreciate you being here. I get it. I understand. And I really appreciate you making the time. And my sincere hope is that I can give you some real value in today's topic that might equip you moving forward to make the changes that you feel are necessary for your personal journey. Because you don't necessarily have to consider yourself addicted to pornography to recognize that lust or pornography can be affecting you. And that's really what I'm here to explore today. Where does normal attraction, a thought, or a desire cross over into something that's actually beginning to control your life? Because that's where I think the hidden danger starts to show up. I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about how addictions start and what addiction really is. Today, ultimately, my goal is to just give you a handful or give you the keys, perhaps, that help you recognize something may be taking a hold of your life. And maybe this isn't something that you've actually considered before. Maybe you're just beginning to recognize something isn't right. Maybe you're actually in quicksand. You're knee deep in it right now, and you feel like there's no way out. There's no way to break those chains. Or maybe you're on the other side of it and you just need a little bit of reinforcement to keep heading in that forward direction. Well, for some of you out there, maybe this has never really been an issue for you at all, but you would like to understand it better. Maybe it's so you can recognize it if it does become one. And so my goal is to create the awareness and some value for you today so that you walk away from today's episode, today's podcast, with something tangible that you can actually put into action. Because I think everybody that's listening to this episode can probably find a place somewhere along that progression, somewhere on that scale you fit in, or you know someone that does. And today we're specifically looking at that lust and pornography because I think there's a lot more to this topic than simply asking whether someone's addicted to it. Because lust doesn't always show up in pornography. It can be a thought, it can be an image, it can be a fantasy, it could be something you're reading, something you're watching, it could be something that you're telling yourself. I think it's important that, for me, I'm as open and honest about this as possible. Because when it comes to lust, I've actually been married twice in my life. I've documented that journey in previous episodes, and I believe that I married beautiful people both inside and out. And obviously, attraction is a big part of choosing a life partner. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. It's important to have that connection with your spouse. But I've also made plenty of decisions in my life based on lust. And quite often, more often than not, those decisions have brought major consequences. And so I'm not coming at this from a place of having it all figured out. I'm certainly not some master guru and I've got it all mastered, every aspect of this. This is something that's been part of my life for many decades, going all the way back to when I was a kid. And I have spent the last 18 months during this podcast journey really working on mastering it. And I want to help people who want to make a change without feeling like they have to fix everything today or master it overnight. Because we all have desires, we've all got thoughts and imaginations, and I don't want to persecute someone for having them. What we're talking about is when those thoughts and those desires, they take a hold and they start overwhelming the other areas of your life that are important to becoming the best version of yourself. And so I've had times in my life where I've allowed lust to have complete control over me. It's something that can start as a thought. It can become a behavior, a habit, and eventually it's something that starts controlling your whole life. And I think that's where we need to be honest with ourselves. And Solomon, I quote him a lot, but he really speaks to this well in the Proverbs, because he speaks and says there's a ton of warnings that he gives about being captivated by beauty and getting too close to temptation. And then he equates it to saying, well, you think you can play with fire and not get burned. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And I also think it's important that we understand this isn't just a men's issue. We have a lot of people listening to this from different age groups and different backgrounds, and men and women both struggle with lust. Now, men do have significantly higher average testosterone levels than women, and depending on the study, it can be debated, but I've read and seen a lot of materials say that it's up to 20 times the testosterone levels of women, but that does not mean women are immune to lust. They just experience it differently. And so men can find women to lust after visually, and women can do something very similar, and they can do it through books. And I remember a few years ago when I had my training studio, there were some books released. And I remember all the women in the gym, they couldn't stop talking about it. They're sharing the books, and, back then it was not so digital in the world, but they're sharing these books and they're talking about the characters, and they're talking about things that are happening in the stories and some of the scenes, and it's quite graphic. And they're talking about these fictional men and all of these situations as though they were real people, real events, real moments, real moments of passion. And honestly, to me, it was fascinating, even then back at the time, watching this unfold, because from my perspective, knowing what I was going through at the time, to me, it was the equivalent of watching a bunch of teenage boys passing around a Playboy magazine in the locker room. Now, I'm not saying that every romance novel is pornography, but I am saying that we need to stop pretending that these things are automatically innocent, simply because they come in the form of a book. Now, some of these stories, these romance novels, are intentionally designed to stimulate fantasy, emotional attachment, sexual attraction, the passion we talked about. And when you repeatedly create this perfect fictional character who says the perfect things, is the perfect gentleman, he looks the perfect way, you create this perfect fantasy that you can then start creating an unrealistic expectation on for what attraction, romance, and relationships are supposed to look like in real life. And I watched it all unfold, and to me, that's the same underlying problem that we're talking about. You're creating something in your mind that reality may never, more than likely, ever be able to reproduce. And I know video games can create another version of this, because you can find these characters that are perfectly figured. They got the muscle tone just right. They got the alluring eyes. They got the chiseled jawlines. I mean, it's like some daytime soap operas. And again, I'm not saying that there's something inherently wrong with playing a video game. They're different than the Pong we used to play with a stick on each side of the screen and a dot drifting up and down, right? Things have changed significantly now. But we have to recognize what our minds are being exposed to and what we are repeatedly choosing to focus on. They suck you in. And I think this is where we need to be really careful, because lust is everywhere. It's in the movies, it's in the TV shows, music, the social media. the gym, the mall, and even in church. Now, that last one that I've listed probably catches most of you off guard because you're going to say, well, surely I can go to church. I'm safe there. But we all know people go to church, they get dressed up, guys, girls, young, old, and they want to look sharp. You don't usually see anyone that doesn't look their best. And there's still a tremendous amount of sexual tension and energy. It's all around you. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with going to church, but I'm saying you have to recognize that the temptation doesn't disappear just because you've walked into a church or some Bible study. So no, I don't think there's anything wrong with church. I don't think there's anything wrong with books or going to the gym. No, but you've got to be grounded enough in who you are and who you're trying to become that you can tolerate what's around you without allowing it to hijack you. And I've been in the fitness business over 2 decades, and I've spent years, countless, tens of thousands of hours rubbing shoulders with people who are half-dressed. They're working feverishly to create this ultimate body. And I have always said and felt that there's a lot of people out there that are spending more time actually getting ready for the gym than they actually spend in the gym. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to look good. You know, you throw your hair in a ponytail and run a comb through your hair, throw your clothes on, and get your bum to the gym. It's not that hard. Because one of the most common excuses I hear from people over the years is that they don't have time for their health and fitness. And they feel this pressure going to a gym because everyone's so done up. You don't need 45 minutes getting ready to go and work out and get hot and sweaty. Get yourself dressed and go to the gym. And so I've been in this business a long time, and I've always wanted to make sure that the gym does not completely turn into a nightclub or a pickup joint. And sadly, that seems to be what it's becoming. And I'm not saying you shouldn't be able to meet people there and find people with common ground and people that are like-minded searching for better health and fitness. I think that's one of the greatest things about it is accountability and friends that you get to meet there. And you can certainly meet people that have very similar goals, young or old, male or female, it doesn't really matter. They're desiring to improve themselves, whether it be rehab or balance work. It's healthy. But again, what I'm looking at here is the motive behind what people are doing. Because are you there to get healthier, or are you there because you're looking for something else? I won't chase that too far, but I remember as a kid, if I wanted to see images that were, provocative or suggestive, I had to actually go looking for them. And so maybe it was a magazine, maybe, later towards my late teens, it was the internet, and it was just starting to come out. But these days, you don't actually have to go looking for that kind of imagery. And that's what we're talking about with the gym. You just have to exist. It's in front of you. And I think for me, I've definitely realized that over the years, being in an environment where that stimulation is constantly around you, it creates a tremendous amount of burnout. Because it's not just what you see, it's the constant demand on your senses, your attention, your ability to exercise self-control. And I don't think anybody that's listening to this has to think too hard about what I'm describing here, especially if you've spent any time in a gym environment. I've actually looked at it, and I think I've actually found there have been times in my journey where I've really enjoyed stepping back from my carpentry work and leaning into it a little bit more heavily, because I can work on a project, I can paint someone's house, I can spend an entire week there without actually seeing another human being, and I loved it. And there's something peaceful about it. And as I put this episode together, I realized I think that's where my peace came from when I stepped out of that career path for a little while. because your mind, your senses, your entire central nervous system are constantly being bombarded with stimulation and the demand to regulate your response to it because it just keeps coming in. And so there's, to me, a certain peace that comes from being able to focus on a project, work with your hands, and just be present with what's actually in front of you. And that's something that I've had to learn and understand about myself over the years, because I don't know how many times I've heard this for the last 20 years, and it's getting more and more, where someone will come up and say, man, how do you work in this environment? And as I'm sitting here and I'm recording this content today, I realize why there's probably been so many times where I've found tremendous value in stepping away, or for a lot of people that don't understand, reducing my availability in the gym. Why aren't you there as much as you could be? Because it's not necessarily that I don't love the industry. It's because I've learned that I need balance, not just from this, but from other things. But I needed to create that space in my life to withstand the constant stimulation and the demand to stay focused on who I'm trying to become. And I think that's another important lesson for anybody listening. I think sometimes the strongest form of self-control isn't proving that you can stand in the middle of that temptation forever. It's exhausting. Sometimes it's just recognizing that you've been overstimulated and you need to create enough space for your mind and your body and your spirit, your soul to rest. And then social media creates a whole nother beast to this, a whole nother layer, because it might not necessarily be pornography in the old school sense. But in some ways, I've found it become absolutely more dangerous. The subtlety of the trap is not as obvious. You're just scrolling, you're just watching a video, you're looking at somebody's page, and you're watching some content. But if you're repeatedly going back because you're getting something from it, you got to be honest with yourself. What's really happening? And I've had to learn this myself. I never had social media for decades. I didn't want it. And this is partly why. I used to justify the behavior by saying, when I'm looking at images on the internet, it's not porn. I'm just looking at these pictures. But at some point, I had to start being honest with myself and say, well, Matt, what's the difference? Because if it's stimulating a sexual response in me and I'm just calling it something different, it doesn't actually change what I'm doing. I'm just using a different word to describe the same and justify the same behavior. And to me, that's one of the hidden dangers, because we can become really good at negotiating with ourselves. And I think we actually have to look at how different the world is today, especially when I grew up in the 80s. I was born in the 70s, so I'm a young tacker in the 80s. And when I was growing up, I remember there being one television in the house and everybody used the same TV. There's no, these days you get a TV in every bedroom. Everyone's got a cell phone and hand all day, for crying out loud. You've got the tablets, you got the laptops, gaming stations in every bedroom. Back then there was one TV, and honestly, whatever Dad was watching is what we watched. So we watched a lot of black and white stuff, Marx Brothers and Danny Kaye and Abbott and Costello, Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin, the classics. And they felt very benign in comparison to what's on TV today. And thinking back, we had 4 channels. And I think one of them stopped working at 6 p.m. So we had 3 channels. You weren't constantly being exposed by there's just hundreds, if not thousands, of channels that you've got available now. And so today you look and everyone's got their own TV in the bedroom. They've got their own gaming stations everywhere. They've got tablets, they've got phones. And it's all sitting there right in your hands, your bedroom, your nightstand. And as I think about that, what we're doing when we give teenagers a cell phone, and you consider their bodies are going through this huge transformation, and hormones and testosterone and attitudes are fluctuating and developing, and they're just trying to figure out what the hell's going on with their bodies. And so it's like giving kids a big box of fireworks and a box of matches and hoping it all works out. We need to understand what it is that we're putting in their hands. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't give your kids a phone. I don't want to be that parent that tells you what to do, but we have to understand the environment that we're creating for them, the pressure that we're putting on them. Because the teenager, I would say today, has more access to more information, more images, more stimulation, certainly more sexualized content in 5 minutes on their phone than I probably saw in an entire year when I was growing up. And then we wonder why people have such a difficult time with controlling their attention. And when you step back and you look at it all, I think to me it becomes pretty obvious that it's not confined to one generation. It's not one gender. It's not one religion, one culture. It's not even one particular environment. It's absolutely everywhere. It's in our homes, it's our phones, entertainment, workplaces. It's in our relationships. And sometimes it's even in those places that we talked about that were supposed to be safe. And so now you start to get to a point in this conversation where you say, well, okay, what the hell am I actually meant to do about it? Because if we're going to acknowledge how powerful these desires can be, then we've also got to talk about how do we fight back. And I think the first place is we've got to start with something that we actually have control over. And that is your thoughts. Everything starts with a thought. And we have the ability, we were designed with this ability to dismiss a thought before we allow it to become something that we speak out of our mouths. And when we're tempted, we have that emotion that starts running through us before we really realize what's happening. We've seen it, we've read it, we're hearing it, but we have this built-in ability to recognize that thought if we're in tune and we can dismiss it. And you can speak it out loud. You can say, no, I'm not going there. That's not who I am. Or that's not who I'm becoming. And that's something that the Almighty blessed us with and designed us with to be able to do that. The power of the tongue has the power of life and death. So use those words. But you've got to use them. You've got to speak it out loud if you have to, because it's got power, but you've got to choose to do it. At the very inception of something that's becoming a thought, you've got a much better chance of stopping it before it becomes the behavior or before it becomes the habit. And ultimately, before it starts becoming something that is now controlling your life. So you've got to catch it early. Catch it while it's still that thought. And think about what we're being shown, and I'm seeing this a lot, but I hear it as well. People go out, they have a great time, they meet someone, they hook up, as they say, and then they move on. And it's portrayed as normal, it's portrayed as fun, it's an easy path to that immediate satisfaction. And everybody knows the places, wherever you live around the world, that I'm talking about. You've all got them, we all do, where there's this underlying understanding that people are there to have this great time. And if things go a certain way, then you're going to end up potentially going home with someone. And I really have to question that. I have to wonder if we've gotten to a point where this has become so acceptable that we are creating a real life skin deep environment. So instead of developing these relationships and getting to know people and understanding who you are yourself and figuring it out, and really figuring out, honestly, who is actually the right fit, a good fit for you moving forward in your life other than that moment. Because we're becoming more focused on, okay, who can give me the most pleasure right now, right here, in this moment? And that's a really different question. One is about something that you're trying to build long term, and the other one is about satisfying the need, the flesh, right there and then. Because pornography isn't just change the way you look at things. It starts changing what you expect and how you live. It changes what you're out there doing and looking for. And it can make that immediate gratification feel more important than the slow process of building something that actually stands the test of time. And I want to speak to something that I think a lot of people may be experiencing, because there are seasons in life where you are under enormous stress, tremendous burden. You're working incredibly hard, you're carrying a lot of responsibility. And at the end of all that, you naturally want some kind of release. And sometimes physical intimacy isn't available. Maybe you're single, maybe you're separated geographically, if someone's traveling. Maybe you're going through a challenging or difficult season where that connection isn't available right now. And if physical touch is an important part of how you experience connection, I understand how difficult that can be. Those desires don't just suddenly disappear. They're part of being human. And I don't think there's anything wrong with acknowledging that, because pretending that those desires don't exist doesn't make them go away. I mean, I've tried. But here's where I think the real question begins, and it's, what do you do with the thing that you desire and it's not available? Because that's where self-control becomes real. Can you experience the loneliness, the frustration, the desire, and the lack of connection without actually allowing those feelings to dictate your behavior? Can you still respect yourself when nobody's watching? Very hard. To remain honorable when you aren't getting what you want. And I understand how difficult that season can be, because I've lived it. But I also learned the question isn't simply, how do I satisfy this desire? It's, who am I becoming while I'm going through it? And sometimes the most important victory is then actually getting what you want. It's proving to yourself that what you want doesn't own you. And maybe some of you are listening to this saying, okay, well, what about me? What if I'm married? What if I have legitimate needs? What if I'm in a relationship where something important is missing? Or maybe you're listening because you're trying to help a spouse who's struggling with lust or pornography. I'd like to talk about that for just a minute, because in a relationship, it doesn't automatically make this conversation any easier. In fact, I think it becomes more complicated, because now you're not just dealing with your own desires. You're dealing with another person's needs, another person's expectations, and another person's understanding of what makes them feel loved. And this is where I think, for me, the work of Dr. Gary Chapman is really important. It was in his book, The 5 Love Languages. It became a New York Times #1 bestseller, and it sold, I think, more than 20 million copies. And so this isn't some random theory that somebody just came up with yesterday or I'm mumbling on about. This is framework that has helped tens of millions of people better understand how they actually receive love and how they give it. And one of those 5 love languages is physical touch. And I think physical touch is particularly important to this conversation. That's why I'm bringing it up, because it doesn't automatically mean intimacy. It can mean affection. It can mean holding hands, a hug, or simply being physically close to the person that you love. It can mean physical reassurance that says, hey, I'm here, I love you, you matter to me. And for somebody whose primary love language is physical touch, the absence of that connection can feel very different than it might to somebody else. And it matters inside of a marriage, because you're committed to that person. And so you got one person who might feel deeply loved when their spouse does something for them, an act, and another one might feel loved when their spouse spends quality time. Time is their love language. And other people might benefit from those words of affirmation. It's a great book. I recommend it. And another person might be thinking, I need physical affection. I need to feel close to you. That's how I experience love, and that's part of your childhood. And if you don't understand those differences, you can very easily have two people who genuinely love each other and still feel like they're not actually getting what they need. And that can create an enormous amount of frustration, rejection, loneliness, mostly misunderstanding in a relationship. And I think this is going to be very carefully said here, because having a legitimate need for affection, connection, physical touch, it does not automatically, in my opinion, make that need lustful. And it doesn't automatically make that need pornography to have that. It doesn't give anybody certainly permission to step outside the boundaries of their marriage. And I think it does mean that both people need to be understanding and put time and effort in understanding what's actually happening there. Because after that honeymoon period wears off, this is what you're left with. You got to understand what's going on. Because you can now have a conflict between the need and the want, and they're not always the same thing. You may want something right now, but that doesn't mean you have to have it. And at the same time, your spouse may actually have a legitimate emotional need that you don't naturally understand because you aren't wired the same way. And this is where the communication becomes critical. You've got to be able to say, this is what I'm experiencing. This is what makes me feel loved, and this is what I'm missing. And you've got to be willing to listen to the other person say the same thing without immediately turning that into an accusation. Because if you don't understand each other, then you start just filling in the blanks with assumptions of what they're thinking, what they're feeling. Those assumptions, they become resentment, and resentment becomes distance, and distance creates an environment where temptation starts taking a whole nother level of attractiveness on it. And so that doesn't excuse the bad behavior that can follow. It doesn't justify pornography. It doesn't justify self-gratification, and most certainly doesn't justify being unfaithful. But it does mean we need to understand the environment we're creating inside our relationships. And I think this is where Scripture gives us a little bit of something important to consider. I think it's First Corinthians chapter 7. Paul is saying, husbands and wives, do not deprive one another unless by mutual agreement for a period of time to devote yourselves to prayer. Then he says, and then after that, come together again so that Satan doesn't tempt them because of their lack of self-control. And so I want to be careful to building a whole podcast around that concept. I don't believe that passage is giving either spouse a right to demand intimacy. Marriage doesn't eliminate consent, communication, or the responsibility to love and respect one another. But I also think I don't think we should ignore what Scripture is actually saying there. And physical intimacy matters inside of a marriage, or it wouldn't be written in there. It was obviously an issue that he's saying it. And when it's completely absent for extended periods of time, that can create a tremendous amount of pressure and temptation for the person that's experiencing the absence. And if physical touch is how that person primarily experiences love, then that absence is soul-crushing. They may not simply feel frustrated physically. Now they actually start to feel rejected, unwanted, disconnected, and you begin questioning whether they're attractive, whether they're valued, or whether they're even loved. And now you're not just dealing with the physical desire. Okay, now you're dealing with an emotional pain. It's loneliness, it's rejection, it's the temptation to find release or relief somewhere else. And I understand how powerful those combinations can be. I've lived through seasons where those things can feel almost indescribable. And that's why I don't want to talk about this first person or second person or third person and just say, you know what, it's just a matter of having more self-control. Because sometimes it's an enormous amount of weight that's already sitting on top of that person already. They're trying to remain faithful. They're trying to honor their marriage. They're trying to honor their creator. And they're trying to control their thoughts and their desires. And at the very same time, they're living without the affection, the connection, and the intimacy that they deeply need. And it's a very real battle. And the answer isn't just to give in to temptation. I mean, the answer isn't also just to pretend that the underlying problem doesn't exist. The answer is to bring the problem to light, to talk about it, to understand each other. Go the extra mile to do that. To understand how each person experiences the love and work together towards a healthy solution. Because sometimes the solution isn't simply telling somebody to stop having those desires. Sometimes the solution is understanding where those desires are coming from and what do they actually represent? What are you actually missing? And whether they're a healthy way for these two people to reconnect. And I think that conversation is incredibly important for anyone that's married or in a committed relationship. Because you can love your spouse deeply and still have very different needs. And if the physical touch, as that book talks about, is a major part of how one of you experiences love, then that has to be understood. It's not used as a weapon. It's not used as leverage. It can't be used as an excuse for destructive behavior either. It's got to be understood. Because the goal is not to simply get what you want. The goal is to understand each other well enough to build a relationship where both people see or feel seen, they feel valued, loved, and respected. There's this passage in the book of James, and I think it describes this progression really well. It talks about desire, conceiving, and when that desire has fully developed, it gives birth to sin. And when that sin is fully grown, it gives birth to death. And I've always remembered that passage. So think about that progression for just a minute. It starts somewhere. And for me, I can actually remember where some of this started for me. I remember the first time as a teenager, I was introduced to provocative material. I remember who introduced it to me. I remember the image. I remember the name of the person in the image. And I remember the emotion and the feeling of seeing it for the very first time. And that is incredible to me because decades later, I still remember it. And that's how much impact something like that can actually have on us. And that's why I think that we talked about it, the hidden danger of giving teenagers these temptations directly into their hands is something that we really need to take seriously. Because when I was growing up, if I wanted to see something like that, it wasn't sitting in my pocket. It wasn't on my phone sitting beside my bed. It wasn't being pushed into my social media feed. You know, it had to be a magazine or in the late 90s, mid-late 90s when the internet was coming out, right? You had to go and physically seek it out. It was something you had to pay for and log into and dial up. You know, there were barriers, and today those barriers have completely disappeared. And that's why I think we need to be so intentional about what we're putting into the hands of our children. I think parenting deserves a whole conversation here on its own because as a parent of two girls, one of the things that I have to understand is that our kids, they learn what they live. They learn what they see, they learn what they hear, they learn what they feel when they're around us, the energy. And if we are exhibiting this self-control that we're talking about and the discipline and a driving force to make sure that nothing owns us, then I believe our children around us can grow up seeing these attributes. They're modeled in front of them. They're not just hearing this concept that self-control matters, the fruit of the spirit, self-control, go do it. They see what it looks like. And they see what that discipline looks like. They're living and they're seeing what does it mean to recognize temptation and decide that it doesn't get to control you. Because our kids are growing up in a world now that is dramatically different from the one that many of us listening grew up in. And I don't want my children to simply tolerate the environment until they become the next victim of it. And I want them to know that their parents they've been through it, they've wrestled with it, they've learned from it, and they've figured out how to navigate it. Because there's a huge difference between telling your kids how they should live and actually allowing them to watch you live it. And that's part of parenting. It's part of becoming the best version of yourself. And not just for you, but for the people who are watching and learning from you. And I think there's another piece to this that's important. I've read a lot of this work and material from Dr. Joe Dispenza, where he talks about different emotional states. And there's an energy associated with them. And one of the things that really stood out to me was the idea of lust being down at the very bottom of the scale. And it's below things like control, anger, fear, guilt, shame, suffering, and pain. Now, I'm not presenting that as some scientific fact. It's just great material that I've read through, and it makes a lot of sense. I'm telling you that this is something that I've been studying and really thinking about and looking through. Because if you think about that for just a second, everybody has been through some form of suffering. Everybody has experienced fear, guilt, anger, shame, certainly pain. And to think about lust as something that you can take and put even further down the scale than those things is staggering to me. And it makes me wonder if there's a reason that lust is used so effectively to distract people. Sex sells, as they say. Because if you can keep somebody focused on something that produces that temporary hit, that temporary satisfaction, and then it leaves them with this guilt, this shame, frustration, regret, then you've taken their attention away from something else. You've taken their bandwidth, you've taken their focus, their time, and that's the hidden danger. It's not simply a few minutes that you spend doing something. It's what happens afterwards. And so you feel good while you're doing it. And that's what makes it dangerous. Because you spend a certain amount of time, sometimes clearly way more than you should, and then when the act is completed or the time is spent, you are left with the consequences. And you've spent time, your attention on something that ultimately doesn't move your life forward. It's an enormous sponge of your attention. And it creates this false sense of security because, well, you feel good while you're doing it. Until eventually it all costs something. Maybe it's your marriage, your relationship with your kids, your finances, your relationship with the Almighty, your career, your parenting, your health, or simply just the ability to actually become the person that you know you're capable of becoming. And so whatever it is, when something hijacks your emotions, your physical actions, your finances, your thoughts, your intentions, your time, you got to start asking yourself, what kind of fruit is this thing actually producing? And that, again, is the hidden danger. It's not just the act itself. It's what that behavior starts taking away from you. The time, the attention, your creativity, your focus, your relationships, parenting, career, money, goals, and ultimately the future that you're trying to build. Now, I've read that pornography can produce a dopamine response that is dramatically greater than a genuine intimate encounter. And I've read that it can be 20 times the dopamine intensity of an actual intimate encounter, let alone taking care of it yourself. Now, I haven't proven that stat myself, but experiencing it over the years, I can understand that the concept behind what I'm saying there is worth trying to understand, because if you repeatedly condition yourself to receive that intimate, that sexual stimulation without intimacy, without any commitment, without communication, without all the work that comes from a real relationship, then you start creating something in your mind that isn't reality. And for a lot of people, they don't realize that getting into that regularly, if it's 20 times the dopamine hit, you're creating a world that's not reality, especially when it comes to having one spouse or one committed long-term goal. And the value of the long-term growth that that bond can create. See, these old people, 80, 90 years old, still holding hands. It's fantastic. I'm not saying that's the goal for everybody, but it's kind of cool to see. They made it 60, 70 years. They have a bond that's like no other, and if you listen to them, they'll tell you about it. They went through thick and thin. They went to the edge of hell and back quite often, but they say quite often it was worth it. And now pornography works against that. And if you train your brain to prefer a fantasy over a real relationship, you can end up pouring your time, your effort, your energy into something that doesn't produce the long-term fruit that you actually say you want. And if you're alone and you're looking for a spouse, you will also start setting these expectations that aren't realistic. They're not attainable. And it's certainly not the kind of pressure that you want to put on another person to live up to. And so I want to talk about this and speak to somebody that might be listening that's single. Or maybe you're married, maybe you're separated, maybe you're divorced, but you're going through a season of that loneliness. And there are times in our lives where these desires can feel absolutely overwhelming. And maybe you don't have a relationship or a situation where you can satisfy those needs and desires. And maybe you're going through that rejection. Maybe your relationship isn't what you hoped it was going to turn out to be. And maybe you feel completely alone. And those can be really difficult seasons. And it's very easy to tell yourself, well, what does it matter? I'm not hurting anybody. I've heard that a lot. But I'm going to challenge you to think about this differently. The things you repeatedly do, they do create patterns. And those patterns influence the person that you're becoming. Think about somebody that wants to love or go out and surf, and you go out surfing every day and you're going to run into other people that surf, and now you got something in common. You got a common interest. You got a common goal. You develop friendships, relationships. And the same thing happens with someone that's off and loves to study. You know, they're spending time in libraries, quiet spaces, classrooms, environments where other people are also studying and working towards something. And those people find that common ground. And so think about it. When you repeatedly put your energy into those things, it helps determine the environment that you're likely to spend a lot more future time in. And so when you look at it, it shapes the direction you're going in, where you spend the time. And so if you're not in a relationship, or even if you are in a relationship and things aren't going the way you planned, then falling into lust and pornography and self-gratification, it's not going to simply solve it. It's not going to solve that loneliness only for that moment, or solve that rejection. It doesn't solve the underlying problem. And I understand how hard that is, because I have spent years living in it. But I want to encourage you to understand it's what do you do when nobody's watching? And it matters, because the energy that you're generating through your thoughts and your choices and your behavior, it's either moving you towards the future, like being a great surfer or a great studier or achieving that, or it's driving you away from it. And so if you're alone, feeling rejected, frustrated, or you're just simply unsure how to overcome the challenge that you're facing, don't fall into the trap of telling yourself it doesn't matter. It matters. It matters way more than you realize, because it's helping determine who you're going to become. Certainly what you'll tolerate and what you attract moving forward. And you may not be able to see the consequences yet. It doesn't mean there's not consequences coming. And I'm not saying this as somebody that's mastered everything about this. And I think that's why I've decided at this point in the podcast series to talk about it. It's important to me. I don't want people to look at anybody with an addiction and say, man, why can't I just get over it? It doesn't make any sense. Because everybody has something. Everybody's going through something, some form of challenge. And quite often the addiction can highlight an area in our lives. And it needs the attention. And sometimes people use those addictions to numb the pain. They use it to fill a void. And sometimes they use it, well, to avoid something that they don't want to deal with. And to me, that's why this is such a personal journey and took weeks to put this together, because it's vulnerable, it's challenging. People don't want to expose themselves as being a failure. And that's why I've been putting in the work in for the last 18 months and really trying to understand and mastering this new version of myself. And it's not been easy by any stretch. And that's why I chose to talk about it today, because there's people out there dealing with temptation and desire and lust, or any number of things that control their time, their attention, and takes over their lives. And one of the tools that can be incredibly valuable is the accountability side. And a lot of programs provide that. And there's huge value in it. That's why it works. But what if that's not something that you want to do right now? What if that's not where you feel comfortable putting yourself? I think there's an opportunity to find one person in your life that you can be vulnerable with, and someone that you can open up to and talk to and allow to hold you accountable. But that person needs to be selected with a very fine-tooth comb, because you've got to be willing to open up and be vulnerable and give them the keys to what you're going through so they can actually be the best support system for you. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's your best friend. It could be somebody outside of your current circle of influence, because there's a good chance that the circle of influence around you is actually contributing to the problem. Like we talked about earlier, 90% are neutral or even encouraging. And so there may be some tough decisions that have to be made about the people you're hanging around with. Might not be an easy conversation to have. There's going to come some times where tough decisions about the people that you're hanging around who aren't necessarily in alignment with who you're trying to become have to be had. And if you truly put in the work to establish where you're going, you're going to have to determine whether these people, well, whether they fit the plan or not. You may find a ton. Again, if the stats are true, you might find 96% resistance from people who don't want to change. These people, they're content with where their life is. It feels good. I like it. It's common. It's normal. There's people who don't have dreams, maybe. They don't have goals. They're quite happy being miserable and satisfying that in the rut that they're in. And sometimes they actually don't want you to succeed and break out of it. Because when you start changing, what it does is it highlights the fact that you're changing and they're not. And that's a huge challenge. And so you got to be aware of that before you start this process. You got to be thoughtful about who you talk to and who you trust and who you allow to influence you, give away your power. I did an episode on that. And sometimes that may mean having some seriously difficult conversation with the people that you love. It could even be your spouse. They may not understand everything that you're going through. And that doesn't automatically make them the enemy. We're not trying to cast the spouse or your significant other out here. But you have to be able to communicate honestly about what you're experiencing and what you're trying to change. Because if you're serious about becoming somebody different, the people closest to you may need to understand what that process looks like. And there may be some times where you got to change your environment or change your boundaries or the amount of access that certain people, and you know who I'm talking about, everyone's got someone in their life they can think of right now. Maybe you got to limit the access that they have to you in your life at this time. It's not because you hate them. It's not because you think you're any better than them. It's because you finally decided that where you're going matters. And at the end of your life, no one's responsible for whether you did or didn't succeed. That's on you. It falls on your shoulders. And I hope that nobody's out there that's sitting there thinking, well, I don't want to do that. And then you get to this age, you get to the end, if you live long enough and you've run your best race, you've spent some golden years together, and you start looking back now more than looking forward. And maybe you gave away your power to somebody else. I certainly don't want that for you. I don't want it for me. I don't want you to look back and feel like you allowed, or I allowed somebody outside of that to stop me from becoming the very best version of myself. And that's why the decisions matter. Because you have to establish now where you're going, whether the people around you are helping you get there or if they're actually keeping you from getting there. Now, something else that I've been working through recently is learning to understand who you are, who I am, and being able to have conversations with a future version of myself. And I certainly think there's probably a couple of you out there. Matt's completely lost his marbles. He's gone troppo. And I'm not saying you got to sit in a chair and have a name on a chair opposite you and you say one thing and you race around and sit in the chair and talk back to yourself. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about if you've put in the work to genuinely understand who you are and who you're going to be, if you've got nothing distracting you from becoming that person, and that's who you are practicing to be with every thought, every effort, every dollar you spend, then you are becoming that better. You're becoming that improved version, that successful version according to your goals of yourself. And when you sit there in silence, you can start to understand what I'm talking about here. You can think through the advice that version, that future version of yourself would give you. It's no different than when you speak to a kid and they haven't fully developed an area of their life and you're helping them understand why you don't touch the stove. It's not safe because they can't understand the pain that they're in if they were to touch it. So you don't give them some giant lecture about something that they're not prepared for. You got to help them understand. I think what happens is when you understand who you are and who you're trying to be and who you're going to be, who I am, then having those conversations isn't so hard for you to get your brain around. Because I'm not some sort of weirdo that's out there talking to myself, but if you can slow down your thoughts to understand what I'm trying to get at here, I think there's real value in it. Because there are times where I know myself better than anybody else, even that person you find with that fine-tooth comb. And I know exactly what I need to say to myself, to calm myself down, to redirect myself, and to help keep myself moving in the direction that I've committed to. And I've been working through some awesome material from Dr. John Bradshaw, and it's in his book, Homecoming. And this book spent an entire year at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. So again, it's not some random material that I'm finding. It remained on that list for 2 more years. It's a terrific book, but it's not easy. He talks about understanding who you were as a child and learning how to comfort that child. And so I'm still working through this book and I haven't finished it yet, but I didn't want to wait until I'd mastered the concept before talking about it because it's important to today's topic because it's making an impact on me. And there's that application that we're talking about because sometimes we're trying to become this future version of ourselves, and we're still carrying parts of ourselves that we never learned how to deal with the pain from childhood, and that fear and that rejection and whatever else it is that you find that's within you and was there the whole time. And sometimes we reach for something because it gives us something in that moment that we never learned to give ourselves in a healthy way. And so that's still something I'm working through that material on. There's a lot of value for me in being honest about it, because I think you've also got to look at the belief system that you have. For those of us that believe in Yahweh, there's more to it, because we have a Heavenly Father that talks to us too. And there's this spiritual force that's like no other, that is with you every step of the way, someone that knows you better than anyone or anything around you, past, present, or future. And the Creator, Yahweh, in my understanding, is available 24/7, 7 days a week, year in, year out. My goodness, He's been patient with me. And I have to give Him thanks on a regular basis for having patience as I work through this and learn to master it, and then try and help others so that I can speak to it and understand where people are at with probably one of the most addictive things that we've ever seen. And so I think, in my opinion, the written word is giving us these guideposts and things that can help keep you in your lane and on the rail. And James talks about it through persevering through trials so that you can become mature and complete, not lacking anything. And then it says, if any of you lack wisdom, you should ask and it will be given. But there is this warning about doubting and being blown and tossed like a wave on the sea. And there's a tremendous amount of wisdom in that, because you've got to know where you're going. You have to know, you have to believe, and you have to be willing to stay committed with the emotions. When those emotions start taking over and they start trying to take you in a different direction, you can't be blown and tossed like a wave on the sea. And James also points out, he says, don't merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. And I know Paul also talks about, he says, he knows what he wants to do, but he's not doing it. And so knowing what he doesn't want to do, and then he finds himself doing that instead, I think anybody that's dealt with this can understand the battle of that passage, or even if you don't read the scripture, you understand of having an intent but not being able to follow through on it. You know what you're trying to become, and yet you find that there's still something inside of you trying to pull you in this completely opposite direction, and that's the battle. That's why everything you do has to become very intentional. And this is where I've spent the last 18 months trying to dial this in. Because I don't want to just sit here and tell you to stop doing something. I want to give you tangible things that you can actually use, things that you can put into practice when that temptation shows up, and ways to recognize it before it actually takes control, ways that you understand your triggers and what might be underneath of them, ways to examine the people around you and the environments that you're in and the thoughts that you're allowing to stay in your head and decisions you're making when nobody else is watching. Because I've spent copious amounts of time, decades, working through this. And I've tried to take what I've learned and turn it into something today, hopefully, that somebody out there listening can actually use. I don't expect anyone to fix everything today. I don't expect you to wake up tomorrow and suddenly have every temptation mastered. It's just not realistic. But I do believe that you can make a decision today about the direction you're going. And sometimes the first victory is simply recognizing that something needs to change. Then you take the next step and the next one. And eventually you look back and realize that you are not where you used to be. And that's what I've been working towards. Not perfection, but progress. I'm not pretending everything has been completely mastered. but becoming somebody who knows what to do when the battle shows up. And if you're willing to do that work, if you're willing to put in the time and effort, I believe you can change. Not overnight, not without difficulty, but one decision at a time. And that's ultimately what I want you to take away from this. You don't have to have everything figured out. You don't have to be perfect. You don't even have to feel like you're winning every day. But you do have to decide who you're becoming first. And then start making your decisions based on that version, based on that future person that you're becoming. Because at the end of the day, the real question is whether temptation exists. It does. Everywhere, all the time. The question is whether you're going to allow it to determine who you become. And if I take something that I've struggled with and I've spent years, decades trying to understand and turn it into something else and use that experience that helps somebody else, then maybe some of that pain and some of the work and heartache was worth it. And if you're out there right now carrying something that nobody knows about, more likely you are, then I want you to know that you don't have to carry it alone. You can start by acknowledging it. You can start by talking to somebody very intentionally. And you can start by changing your environment. You can start by changing what you allow into your mind. You can start by deciding what kind of person that you want to become. And you can start that today. You can start it right now as we wrap up. Because the hidden danger isn't simply what you did. It's who you could have become while you were spending all of that time doing it. And that's the hidden danger. The creativity you didn't use, the goal you didn't pursue, the relationship you didn't build, the conversation you didn't have, the person you didn't become. And that's why I believe the hidden dangers of lust on pornography are something we should be talking about. So wherever you are today, keep moving forward. Stay focused on who you are becoming. And remember, the goal isn't to become somebody who never experiences temptation. It's not reality. The goal is to become somebody who knows what to do when it shows up. Stay strong, everyone. I will catch you next week. Cheers.